the big story of the week, or at least one of them, has been the death at the end of last week of Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia, and the swirling forces around his absence on the court, and the idea of replacing him or not replacing him. Here to help us make sense out of that fog of confusion and perhaps demystify the process a little bit is Dahlia Lithwick. Dahlia is the legal correspondent and senior editor for Slate, which can be found at slate.com, and hosts the podcast Amicus. And she's joining us now to discuss that. Dahlia, hi.
Thank you for having me. Hi.
Yeah, it's great to have you on the show. I've been looking forward to it. You've been writing as many people have about the Scalia situation as it stands now. First of all, I pronounced amicus, right?
Yes.
Right. Okay, good. For some reason I experienced a moment of self-doubt there, but I guess where I would start with this, it's kind of a broad question. Do with it what you will, but after a week of this process, the more I think about it, the more I think that what the Supreme Court has become, what the nominating process has become, bears absolutely no relationship to what the framers had in mind when all of this was set up. I feel like we've just completely lost the constitutional roots of how this whole thing ought to work. Is that true, you think? Is there any truth to that?
I think it's true at virtually every level. I think, if you even contemplate what advise and consent meant to the framers, they didn't think it meant, obstruct and shout. They really thought that there would be close ties between the Senate and the president, that, this would be a conversation, not, a hostage situation. But even beyond that, I think it's worth realizing that when the framers contemplated life tenure for a Supreme Court justice, what they were really thinking about was people who live to be 55, 60.
Right.
They were not envisioning 30, 40-year terms with nobody ever leaving. And so I think it's just at so many levels, this has broken down, in part because the framers just couldn't have imagined both, the party system, the polarization, but also I think just a court this intrinsic in the national, polity. I mean, I think they did not envision a court that in one term was going to look at abortion and affirmative action and one person, one vote and public funding for unions. That wasn't the court they dreamed of.
Yeah, that's certainly the way it seems, and the whole notion of balance of power, becomes quaint or obsolete if the whole point of nominating or obstructing a nomination for a Supreme Court justice is to preserve the power of your ideology for the next several decades.
No, I think that's exactly right. But, track back and imagine the framers, what they would have thought of the Supreme Court deciding the 2000 election, right? I mean, I think in so many ways we are so, I don't know, I guess the psychologists would call it enmeshed or codependent. Like there is such blurring between the branches. And I really do think that, the folks who say, well, this is going to sort itself out through the elections process, if nothing else, the Constitution can't help us now, but the election will decide this. But of course, the election was absolutely not supposed to decide the composition of the U.S. Supreme Court. That was the point.
Well, and my understanding of the process is that the last election decides who appoints a judge, a replacement judge when someone dies during this term. I thought that was the whole structure. We had an election.
That's absolutely the case. I mean, I think that, you can say, oh, the Thurmond rule, and then it was the Schumer rule, and both sides obstruct, and, there was a lot of talk around the Alito confirmation of filibustering. But to say right out the chute within a half hour of the announcement of Scalia's death, not only that we won't have, a vote, there's not going to be a hearing. There's going to be no human being. Even if Antonin Scalia's own son, Eugene, was put up, we would not have a hearing because we think that we don't have to have a hearing. That is unprecedented. And so I think you can say, oh, both sides play this game, but I don't think the degree of pure nihilism has really ever been what it is right now.
Yeah, I think the nihilism is a good word. We're talking with Dahlia Lithwick, a legal correspondent for Slate. I also think the gotcha, whether it's the Schumer moment or trying to pin on Hillary Clinton and maybe Bernie Sanders. Well, you voted to filibuster Alito. Uh, yeah, but they listened to Alito first. I think the unprecedented part here is we don't care who you nominate. We don't think you can legitimately nominate anybody. That
Right.
to me is unprecedented. Has that ever occurred before? I don't think it has.
It has never occurred that someone would say there will be no hearings. We have seen up and down votes. We have seen, as we're all saying, Obama famously had a problem with Alito, but he listened and he learned, and Alito's record was alarming to him. That's really, I think, fundamentally different from saying you're not really the president. For purposes of nominating a Supreme Court justice, you are functionally not the president. That is really quite different.
Right. I'm surprised nobody has used the headline, "You're not the president of me" yet, but it's basically what we're dealing with here. Dahlia Lithwick is a legal correspondent for Slate, and I guess it's. I'm really glad that you brought up the point that the founders didn't imagine this type of longevity on the court, or that the political situation would become paralyzed and polarized that. That people on either side of the conservative liberal split, for lack of a better word, would cling to the court for dear life well into their advanced years if a president of the other party was in power. That seems to kind of be the case too. And I found myself, by the way, looking at the short list of potential Obama nominees, and I mean, I was biased because one of them once wrote me a complimentary email about something I wrote, so I want that person.
Can you tell
But
us who that is?
sure, Neil Katyal,
Oh,
um,
he's
when he
fun.
was teaching at Georgetown, but actually on the presumption of innocence or guilt in rape cases and how the identity of the victim should not affect that. And he said I made the case effectively. I was very impressed with that. But that aside, I mean, I found myself looking at this list and saying, 51 too old. You know, I like the 45-year-old, whoever that is, which is me doing exactly what I guess it shows that this process is going off the rails, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting because there are good candidates like Merrick Garland, the chief judge of the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, who is simply, I think, disqualified because he's 63. And that's just an incredible notion that we need somebody who's sort of like basically in kindergarten would be optimal if they were in kindergarten and really smart so that
Right,
we
right,
keep them on the court forever. But again, I think it really shows the gamesmanship that goes into this. If you imagine, I mean, think back to the kinds of people who have been not just on the Supreme Court, but transformational justices on the Supreme Court. Hugo Black, Robert Jackson, Earl Warren, Louis Brandeis. These are not people who are confirmable today. None of them. None of them are confirmable. And I think, and John Roberts has been at pains to say neither Scalia nor Ruth Bader Ginsburg could be confirmed in this climate. And so I think as a result, you get a couple of things. One is you get people who are very, very young, and at the same time, they have these extraordinary credentials. They all go to Ivy League schools. They all clerk on the Supreme Court. It's kind of like they're hydroponically raised underground to become the
yeah,
ideal. But I think that you really do not get the kind of plethora of life experience, of crazy written
right.
opinions, of stupid speeches, reckless action that in some ways is really, really important in a court.
Right, and it gets to the full dimensionality of a human being and their experience and how they bring it to their jurisprudence, right? I mean, to me, and we're talking with Dahlia Lithwick, a legal correspondent for Slate and senior editor. To me, what troubles me about all of this is that Well, a couple things, and I want to get to the short list and maybe a little bit of the politics. Just briefly on the short list, the kind of candidates the president is likely to put forward. But I guess one of the things that bothers me about all of this is that we're basically hearing not only that the ideal candidate should be hydroponically grown, but they should be like that android that steps forward without features yet, sort of unformed, so that nobody can pin anything on them. As opposed to someone who's experimented, who's put out ideas in the marketplace of ideas and had them challenged and been wrong and been right and grown and evolved. So I think you've really helped me clarify my own thinking about that, my own concern about that. Now, you've written about the kind of justice President Obama might pick. You've said he's already told us, and just recently Joe Biden said, and it sounded to me like a trial balloon from the White House. Well, maybe he should pick somebody really middle of the road. And I guess let's talk about Biden first. My first reaction was, again, that the process has gone off the rails. That we should be talking about a creative, inventive legal mind coupled with a character of unimpeachable integrity. And instead, we're talking about where, even I, with my politics, I'm a little troubled that we're talking about where they fit on the spectrum, because some of our most interesting judges, it seems to me, our justices, have evolved in unexpected ways on the bench. And I guess where I'm going with this whole question is, are we going to get a kind of poll-tested focus group nomination, or are we going to get the best possible candidate for the court?
Well, I think they're slightly different questions because, of course, each of the people on the short list, you can go down. Jacqueline Wynn on the Ninth Circuit, right? Shrey Srinivasan on the D.C. Circuit, Paul Watford on the Ninth Circuit, Patty Millett on the D.C. Circuit. Each of these people, Loretta Lynch, the Attorney General, each of these people will be fantastic. Each of them will be fantastic. But I do think one of the things we're sliding into, and it worries me a little bit, is that we think that racial and gender diversity is the totality of the diversity we need at the court. And so we say, hey, Srinivasan, his family is from India. Jacqueline Wynn, she was born in Vietnam. And that's important, but it's not the only thing. And I think as important as racial, ethnic, gender diversity is experiential diversity. When Sandra Day O'Connor left the court, we lost our last person who'd ever held elected office on this court. When Ruth Bader Ginsburg leaves the court, we will lose our last person who ever was a civil rights attorney. And so for me, as much as it's important to have, a court that looks like America, and I understand we're already fighting about that Asian Americans want representation, they're right, they should have it. Mexican Americans want representation, they're right, they should have it. But as important as that, I really do think we need somebody who has tried a death penalty case on the Supreme Court. We need somebody who has held elected office. We just need a huge range of experience, and that is in no way a slight on these fantastic appeals court judges, each of whom is brilliant, each of whom went to an Ivy League school. But I just think we've narrowed the pipeline. We are narrowcasting to the point where really there's only one type of job description that can get you onto the court. And in my view, what that weeds out is so many interesting kinds of people. And that really transcends just questions of race and gender and politics.
Yeah, and I think there's a balance there, as you were saying. I was maybe one of the few Americans around who was sympathetic to Sonia Sotomayor for saying, a wise Latina would be a good addition to the process. But I got what she was saying, because she was saying it's a combination of ethnicity and experience. And I think you're talking about the experience side of the equation. You can check the box for any group. And have somebody who doesn't, that's not the only, what I'm trying to say. I'm struggling a little bit. But we're talking with Dahlia Lithwick, a legal correspondent of Slate. I guess last question, a little more political. I don't know if you're that interested in going for it or not. But, everybody's saying, well, if the GOP's obstructionism on all of this stuff is going to hurt them, in some critical Senate races and so on, or politically overall. Do you think undecided voters really care about this issue? Do you have any sense of that?
I think it's hard to tell right now. When we first heard that this was going to hurt the GOP, my reflexive reaction was, why? Since when has obstruction and intransigence hurt the GOP? Maybe shutting down the government was too much. But beyond that, if you think about, and I use the word nihilism calculatedly, the
Hmm.
notion that the best government is no government has not really been a costly proposition. And so the idea that this is too much obstruction, it's not clear. It's also not clear that the court is something that people vote on. People vote on their wallets, they vote on safety, but the court is pretty attenuated, even for Republican voters who do care about the court far more than Democrats do. But all that said, I think it's really a fascinating question to see what's going to happen in June when we have a slew of big ticket cases come down, right? Abortion, affirmative action, the whole list I went through before. One person, one vote. This would have been the biggest term of of my adult
Right.
lifetime. And we're going to see them come down right in June, right in time to put this at the forefront of people's consciousness. And even though we won't have a gay marriage case, we will have, in some ways, cases that impact people's lives really fundamentally. And so I do think that when it comes down that these are all 4-4 decisions, or they're all being held
Right.
over for re-argument, it might become apparent that the court is not an institution that can be shut down for a couple of months and function correctly. People may start to take notice, but I don't know. I'm really, I think when your bargaining position is at the outset, no hearings for anybody ever, that's a tough, to climb down from that is pretty tough.
Yeah, I agree with everything you've said. It'll be interesting to see how those 4-4 decisions affect everything. I'm amazed that Democrats aren't more passionate, engaged with the issue of the Supreme Court. And by the way, in closing, I'll just say I have described the Republicans as nihilists too, although I can never use that word anymore without thinking of the Big Lebowski, the nihilist. We believe in
I
nothing. But
can't use it anymore.
but anyway, listen, Dahlia Lithwick, legal correspondent and senior editor for Slate. Thanks for coming on the show. Thanks for shedding some light on this amazingly murky and complex situation, and keep up the great work.
Thank you so much for having me. Have a good weekend.